The first thing I need you to understand is what the Astronomican sounds like when it is healthy. Not metaphor, not poetry. The actual sensory experience that exists in whatever space psyches occupy when we perceive things that baseline humans cannot. It sounds like a chorus. 15 billion voices, I counted them once during my second year of service, mapped each individual psychic signature in the Gestalt, singing a single sustained note that spans frequencies no acoustic instrument could produce. The pitch exists simultaneously in ranges that would shatter glass and in subsonic resonances that would liquefy internal organs if they were physical sound. But they are not physical sound. They are psychic projection, the combined output of the Astronomican's choir, 10,000 psyches sacrificed daily to maintain the beacon that guides the Imperium's ships through the warp. When I first heard it clearly, I was 16 years old and had just survived my soul binding on Terra. The ritual took place in chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, in spaces carved from bedrock that predated the Unification Wars. They brought us in groups of 50, young psyches culled from across the galaxy, their abilities deemed controllable enough to serve rather than warrant execution. We were led through passages that descended for what felt like hours, the air growing warmer with each level, until we reached the Chamber of Binding. I remember the temperature precisely. 43 degrees Celsius, the heat radiated from the walls themselves as if we were approaching some vast furnace buried at Terra's core. The air tasted of ozone and incense, specifically the corpse starch variety blessed by the ecclesiarchy, which produces a sweet rotten smell that clings to nasal passages for days. My robes were soaked through with sweat by the time we reached the chamber proper. The soul binding took 11 minutes and 47 seconds. I know because I counted every second, trying to maintain some fragment of sanity while my mind was opened completely and exposed to the Emperor's presence. The pain was immediate and total, not physical pain, though my body convulsed and I bit through my lower lip hard enough to taste blood. Psychic pain. The sensation of consciousness being touched by something so vast that touching it burned away pieces of what I had been. When it ended, I was blind. All of us were blind. That is the cost of soul binding. Your eyes cease functioning, burned out by proximity to the Emperor's psychic magnitude. But in exchange, you gain something else. One day, in February 1969, Major, the 15th of Millennium, ran proceed to his own diversity by census, his men, whose failed for a gain ran nowhere many people promised. The ability to perceive the warp directly, to navigate its currents, to hear the Astronomican from anywhere in the galaxy and use it as reference point for faster-than-light travel. Most astropaths describe the Astronomican as distant. A faint lighthouse glimpsed through fog, something you strain to perceive, requiring concentration and focus to detect through the warp's interference. This is normal sensitivity, the standard level of perception that allows astropaths to perform their function adequately. I heard it as if I was standing in the choir itself. The sound filled my consciousness completely from the moment my soul binding ended. 15 billion voices, each distinct, each contributing their fraction to the unified note. I could perceive the harmonic structures, the way certain voices reinforced others, the precise frequencies each singer maintained. I could detect when individual voices failed, and they failed constantly, thousands per hour, replaced immediately by new psychers fed into the system to maintain consistent output. The attending tech priest registered this as unusual during my post-binding evaluation. He ran standard sensitivity tests, projecting psychic signals at various intensities and measuring my detection thresholds. I scored in the 99th percentile. He noted this in my file with clinical language. Subject demonstrates exceptional receptivity to psychic phenomena. Recommend assignment to high-priority communications relay or specialized analytic function. The name mattered then, in my 16th year, when I still thought of myself as an individual rather than a function. They assigned me to the Astropathic Relay Station aboard the Cardinal-class cruiser Undying Fidelity, serving the Segmentum Solar Fleet operations. Standard 5-year posting, renewable based on performance and psychological stability. I reported to the Undying Fidelity 3 weeks after my soul binding, once the physical trauma had healed sufficiently for travel. The ship was 8 kilometers long, a mobile cathedral fortress housing 40,000 crew and passengers. The astropathic chambers occupied a sealed section amidships, isolated behind adamantium bulkheads and layered psychic shielding. 7 astropaths served aboard, working in rotating shifts to maintain continuous communication capability. The senior astropath was a man named Tybalt Crescens, who had served for 41 years and had the resigned exhaustion of someone who had long ago stopped expecting his service to end in anything but death. He showed me to my quarters, a cell 3 meters by 4 meters containing a bunk, a writing desk, and a waste reclamation unit, and explained the duty rotation with minimal exasperation. "You will stand watch for 8 hours daily," he said. His voice carried the particular flatness that comes from decades of psychic communication, where verbal speech becomes secondary mode of interaction. "During your watch, you monitor incoming astro-telepathic transmissions, decode and log them according to priority protocols, and forward appropriate messages to command staff. You will also encode and transmit outgoing messages as directed. Between watches, you rest, you eat, you maintain your psychic disciplines. Nothing else is required or desired." I asked about the Astronomican. Specifically, I asked if the other astropaths heard it as clearly as I did. Tybalt regarded me through his empty eye sockets. His binding had been particularly thorough, leaving not even scar tissue behind, and something that might have been concern crossed his features. "How clearly do you hear it?" he asked. "Constantly," I told him. "Every moment, 15 billion voices in perfect harmony. I can distinguish individual singers if I focus. Then, most of us perceive it as background presence, something we access deliberately when navigating or triangulating. Constant awareness would be difficult, potentially destabilizing. Report to me immediately if you experience psychological strain." But I experienced no strain. The Astronomican was simply there, a constant presence in my consciousness, like breathing or heartbeat for baseline humans. I grew accustomed to it within days. It became the foundation of my existence, the reference point against which all other perceptions were measured. I served my first year without incident. The work was routine. Incoming messages from other ships, other relay stations, other sectors of the Imperium's vast bureaucracy. Outgoing messages carrying orders, reports, requests for resources or reinforcements. The content blurred into sameness. Logistics data, casualty reports, intelligence summaries, all encoded in standardized astropathic formats that reduced complex information to psychic impressions transmitted across light years. During this year, I began cataloging the Astronomican's variations. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I noticed patterns that seemed significant. The beacon was not perfectly stable. It fluctuated slightly, amplitude variations of approximately 0.03%, harmonic drift of 0.017%, individual voice replacement rates averaging 3,412 per hour. These were minor variations, well within normal parameters. The Astronomican had maintained similar fluctuation ranges for 10,000 years, since the Emperor was interred in the Golden Throne. But I tracked them anyway, recording measurements in a personal log that I maintained outside official records. In my 14th month of service, I noticed something unusual. The average amplitude had decreased, not significantly, only 0.008%. Barely measurable, but measurable nonetheless. The Astronomican was very slightly quieter than it had been when I first heard it. I brought this observation to Tybalt during our next scheduled consultation. He listened to my data without interrupting, then asked me to repeat the measurements over the following month to confirm consistency. I did so. The decrease persisted. After 37 days of continuous monitoring, I had confirmed that the Astronomican's amplitude had decreased by 0.009% total. Tybalt reported this to the ship's command staff, who forwarded it to the Departamento Astrographicus on Terra for evaluation. The response came 4 months later. Variation within acceptable parameters. Instruments aboard the Astronomican facility detect no anomalies, advise continued monitoring, but no action required. I accepted this assessment. I was young, inexperienced, possibly detecting artifacts of my own unusual sensitivity, rather than actual changes in the beacon. I continued my duties and my private monitoring, noting the slow, nearly imperceptible weakening, but trusting that the authorities possessed instruments and expertise that exceeded my limited perspective. In my 23rd month, I met epistolary Hadrian. He was not assigned to the Undying Fidelity. He served aboard the strike cruiser Righteous Flame, operating in the same fleet grouping. But during a joint operation in the Aurelia sector, he came aboard for strategic consultation with the fleet command staff. Hadrian was a librarian of the Ultramarines chapter, a space marine psyker whose abilities had been judged controllable enough to avoid execution. He was 347 years old, had fought in 11 major campaigns, and possessed psychic strength that made my abilities seem insignificant by comparison. He was also, I would discover, the only person who would ever believe me about what I was hearing. We met when he visited the astropathic chambers to transmit a coded message to his chapter. I was on duty, and Tybalt assigned me to assist him with the transmission since Hadrian's psychic output required careful handling. Space Marine psychers generate signals too powerful for standard astropathic protocols and can damage astropaths, who are not properly shielded. Hadrian entered the transmission chamber, ducking through the reinforced doorway, his armor's bulk filling the space with ceramite and adamantium presence. I felt his psychic signature immediately. Powerful, controlled, structured like fortress walls around dangerous forces held in perfect check. He radiated authority in ways that extended beyond his physical presence, touching the immaterium itself. "You are young for an astropath," he observed. His voice emerged from his armor's vox grill with slight mechanical distortion, but retained human warmth beneath the augmentation. "How long have you served?" 23 months, my lord," I replied, using the honorific automatically. Space Marines were not technically lords in imperial hierarchy, but no one corrected you for showing excessive respect. "And your sensitivity level?" 99th percentile, my lord. Exceptional receptivity, according to my evaluation. Hadrian was silent for 8 seconds. Then, "Interesting. I require a message transmitted to Macragge, encrypted using Ultima-class protocols. Can you manage the encoding?" I confirmed that I could. We spent the next 47 minutes working together on the transmission. Hadrian generating the psychic content, me encoding and directing it toward the appropriate relay stations that would carry it across the galaxy to Ultramar. During this process, we touched minds briefly, the unavoidable intimacy of psychic collaboration. He felt my perception of the Astronomican. I felt his surprise at its clarity. When the transmission concluded, Hadrian remained in the chamber instead of departing immediately. "You hear the Astronomican very clearly," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, my lord." "How clearly? Describe it." I described it. The 15 billion voices, the harmonic structures, the individual variations, the constant presence that filled my consciousness every waking moment. Hadrian listened without interruption. His psychic presence focused completely on my words. "I have served for 3 centuries, he said finally. "I have worked with hundreds of astropaths across dozens of campaigns. I have never encountered anyone who describes the Astronomican with that level of detail. Your sensitivity is not simply exceptional, it is unprecedented in my experience. Have you noticed changes in the beacon's characteristics over time?" I hesitated, sharing my observations with Tybalt, and through official channels had produced dismissal. But something about Hadrian's focused attention suggested he would not dismiss anything without consideration. I told him about the amplitude decrease, the 0.009% weakening over 23 months. Hadrian's psychic presence shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. Concern carefully controlled. "You are certain of this measurement?" "I have documented it continuously, my lord." The decrease is small but consistent, and when you reported this to the Departamento Astrographicus, they indicated the variation was within acceptable parameters. No action required. Hadrian was silent for a long time. Finally, continue monitoring. Record your measurements with maximum precision. If the weakening continues, report it again through official channels. But also, he paused, also maintain a personal archive, independent of official logs, in case your data is needed later and official records prove incomplete. I understood what he was suggesting, without him stating it explicitly. Keep backup records in case the official system failed to preserve information that might become critical. I agreed to do so. Hadrian departed the undying fidelity 6 hours later. I would not see him again for 7 years. I continued my service, advanced through the ranks of the Astropathic Corps aboard the ship. After 5 years, my posting was renewed. After 8 years, I was promoted to senior astropath when Tybalt died. His heart simply stopped during a transmission session. 49 years of service concluded without ceremony or recognition beyond the notation in personnel records. I inherited his responsibilities and his quarters, slightly larger than my previous cell. I trained the new astropaths who cycled through the ship's roster. I maintained communications for fleet operations across 3 subsectors, and I continued monitoring the Astronomican, documenting its slow, steady weakening. By my 10th year of service, the amplitude had decreased by 0.043% total. The harmonic drift had increased by 0.021%. The voice replacement rate had accelerated to 3,617 per hour. These remained small changes, barely significant, but they were consistent, directional, progressive. The Astronomican was weakening. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but measurably to someone with my sensitivity. I reported this again to the Departamento Astrographicus. The response came 8 months later. Continued monitoring appreciated. No anomalies detected by facility instrumentation. Variations remain within acceptable parameters. In my 13th year, one of the junior astropaths noticed my private logging and asked what I was recording. His name was Cormac, 97th percentile sensitivity, competent if unexceptional. I explained my observations. He asked if he could participate in the monitoring project. We worked together for 3 years, Cormac confirming my measurements through independent observation. His perception of the Astronomican was less detailed than mine. He heard it as unified presence rather than resolving individual voices, but he could detect the amplitude changes when I directed his attention to them. Having corroboration felt significant. I was not imagining artifacts or misinterpreting data. The weakening was real. In my 16th year, Cormac developed the psychic degradation that eventually claims all astropaths. His mind began fragmenting, unable to maintain coherent barriers between his consciousness and the warp's influence. He lasted 3 more months before the degradation progressed to critical state. I was present when they executed him, standard protocol for astropaths who become liabilities. A single bolt round through the skull, psychic presence extinguished instantly. His body was processed through the ship's corpse starch recyclers within 4 hours. I recorded his death in my logs with clinical notation. Astropath Cormac Varen deceased after 19 years' service. Psychic degradation terminated per protocol. Monitoring collaboration concluded. Not numbness, not grief, just absence of reaction. I had witnessed 47 astropath deaths by my 16th year. Natural failures, executions, accidents during transmission. Death was part of our function. Cormac's death was simply another data point in the comprehensive archive of service and cessation. But I missed his corroboration. I missed having someone who understood what I was tracking, who could confirm that my observations reflected reality rather than perceptual anomalies. After his death, I returned to solitary monitoring, recording measurements that no one else could verify. In my 19th year, the Undying Fidelity was reassigned to the Segmentum Obscurus, supporting campaigns against orc incursions in the Cadian Gate region. During this deployment, I encountered Epistolary Hadrian again. He had advanced to Chief Librarian of the Ultramarines' 3rd Company, wore honors earned in combat across 17 additional campaigns, carried authority that radiated through both physical and psychic space. He requested private consultation during his visit to the ship. We met in my quarters, which provided better psychic isolation than the transmission chambers where other astropaths might detect our conversation. "It has been 7 years," Hadrian said without preamble. "Have you continued monitoring the Astronomican?" "Yes, my lord, continuously for 19 years. And?" The amplitude decrease had reached 0.117% total. The harmonic drift had progressed to 0.063%. The voice replacement rate had accelerated to 4,234 per hour. All trends were consistent, directional, progressive. Hadrian reviewed my data in silence. His psychic presence carried weight I had not felt during our first meeting. Something darker, more burdened, as if the 7 years had pressed heavily on him. Finally, he spoke. "I have consulted with librarians across multiple chapters," he said. "I have reviewed what historical records are accessible regarding the Astronomican's performance over the past millennia. Your observations match patterns that have appeared before, during periods of systemic stress. The Great Rift's expansion, the Horus Heresy's aftermath, periods when the Imperium faced existential threats." He paused. "The Imperium is currently stable. No major existential threats are active, which means either your data is corrupted or we are approaching a period of systemic stress that has not yet manifested in ways the Imperium's leadership recognizes. Which do you believe, my lord?" "I believe your data is accurate. I believe the Astronomican is weakening. I believe this indicates something approaching that the Imperium is not prepared for. And I believe that when you report this through official channels, you will continue to be dismissed, because accepting your data would require accepting implications that the Imperium's leadership cannot afford to acknowledge." "What should I do, my lord?" Hadrian was silent for nearly a minute. "Continue monitoring, continue reporting through official channels, but also prepare yourself for the possibility that truth will not protect you. That insisting on accurate observations may place you in conflict with systems that require certain realities to remain unacknowledged. When that conflict comes, and it will come, you will need to decide whether maintaining truth matters more than maintaining your position, your safety, or your life." He placed one massive gauntleted hand on my shoulder. The gesture carried weight beyond physical touch. Psychic connection. Space Marine to Psyche. Warrior to witness. "The Imperium is built on necessary lies," he said quietly, "on fictions that allow it to continue functioning despite impossible realities. Your observations threaten one of those necessary lies. The consequences will follow inevitably from that threat." He departed shortly after. I would never see him again. Later intelligence reports indicated he fell in combat on Cadia 4 years before that world's destruction, killed defending evacuation ships from a chaos incursion. His gene seed was not recovered. In my 23rd year, the Undying Fidelity returned to Segmentum Solar for refit and crew rotation. I was granted leave to visit Terra, my first return since my soul-binding 23 years prior. I used this opportunity to request personal meeting with senior administrators at the Departamento Astrographicus, seeking to present my data directly rather than through filtered official channels. The meeting was granted. I was received by a moderator-level official named Erasmus Cole, who had administered the Departamento's monitoring operations for 47 years. I presented 23 years of continuous measurements, demonstrating the progressive weakening across multiple parameters, showing the consistency and directional nature of the decline. Cole reviewed my data for 43 minutes. Then he set it aside and looked at me through his empty eye sockets with expression that combined professional courtesy and absolute dismissal. "Your measurements are noted," he said. However, the Departamento operates the primary monitoring facility for the Astronomican, located on Terra itself, with direct instrumentation access to the beacon systems. Our instruments detect no weakening, no amplitude decrease, no harmonic drift beyond normal variation ranges, no acceleration in replacement rates. Your observations, while meticulously documented, contradict the facility's own comprehensive data. I pointed out that my sensitivity exceeded normal parameters, that I could detect variations their instruments might not register, that my 23 years of continuous monitoring provided longitudinal data that instrument readings might miss. Cole's expression did not change. "I do not question your sincerity," he said, "but I must question your interpretation. Exceptional sensitivity does not necessarily produce exceptional accuracy. It can produce exceptional perception of artifacts, anomalies in your own reception rather than in the source signal. The Astronomican is maintained by the Emperor's will. To suggest it is failing is to suggest the Emperor's power is diminishing. This is theologically untenable and practically destabilizing." "I am not suggesting anything theologically," I replied. "I am reporting measured observations of a critical imperial system. If my data is wrong, show me the facility's contradicting measurements. If my data is right, investigate the discrepancy." "The facility's data is classified," Cole said. "Access requires authorization levels you do not possess. Your request for investigation is noted in your file, but no further action will be taken at this time. Continue your assigned duties. Monitor the Astronomican if you wish, but understand that your observations will not drive policy changes unless corroborated by official instrumentation." The meeting concluded. I departed understanding that official channels were closed. My data would not be investigated, my measurements would not be validated, my observations would not influence Imperium policy. I was a single Astropath with unusual sensitivity, making claims that contradicted both official measurements and theological doctrine. From the system's perspective, I was either wrong or dangerous, possibly both. I returned to the Undying Fidelity and continued my monitoring, because stopping would not change what I was hearing. The Astronomican was weakening. Whether anyone believed me or not, the beacon was dying, slowly, incrementally, but measurably. And I could not stop hearing it any more than I could stop my heart from beating. The truth continued regardless of whether it was acknowledged. In my 27th year of service, the situation changed in ways that would define my remaining existence. The Undying Fidelity was deployed to the Gould Stars region, prosecuting a campaign against Xeno's threats that had emerged from the galactic void. The deployment was expected to last 18 months. It lasted 4 years. During this deployment, isolated from regular contact with Segmentum Solar, I continued monitoring the Astronomican with increasing precision. The weakening had accelerated. By my calculations, the amplitude had decreased by 0.27% total. Still small in absolute terms, but the rate of decline was increasing. The decay was not linear but exponential, following a curve that suggested systematic failure rather than random variation. I documented this carefully. I ran mathematical projections, modeling the decline curve forward across decades and centuries. The results were concerning. If the trend continued, and I had no reason to believe it would not, the Astronomican would weaken to critical levels within approximately 4,000 years. Within 8,000 years, it would fail completely. These were vast timeframes by human standards. Multiple generations, entire epochs of history. But for the Imperium, which measured its existence in millennia and planned operations across centuries, 4,000 years was strategically relevant time. The Astronomican's failure would mean the collapse of faster-than-light travel, the fragmentation of the Imperium into isolated systems, the end of human galactic civilization as it had existed for 10,000 years. I reported these projections to the ship's command staff, requesting they be forwarded through appropriate channels. The ship's captain, Marcellus Vaughan, reviewed my data personally. He was a practical man, 63 years service, scarred by combat and void exposure, possessed of the particular fatalism that comes from commanding ships in the Imperium's endless wars. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that the Emperor's beacon will fail, that the Imperium will collapse, that everything we serve will end. I am telling you that my measurements indicate progressive systemic weakening that, if continued, will result in critical failure within 4,000 years. 4,000 years, Vaughn repeated. Do you understand how that sounds? The Imperium has existed for 10,000 years. The Astronomican has functioned for that entire period without failure. You are predicting its collapse based on measurements so small they require specialized sensitivity to detect. Measurements that official monitoring facilities do not corroborate. Yes, Captain. That is correct. Vaughn studied me for 17 seconds. I will forward your report, but understand that you are staking your credibility, possibly your life, on observations that contradict 10,000 years of imperial history and theology. If you are wrong, the consequences will be severe. If you are right, the consequences will be worse. The Imperium cannot acknowledge that the Astronomican is failing. The psychological and political effects would be catastrophic. Truth or not, your data is dangerous. It moved through military channels, through administrative channels, eventually reaching the Departamento Astrographicus on Terra. The response came 11 months later. Astropath Valen Corpus is hereby placed under formal review for dissemination of destabilizing information. His measurements are rejected as artifacts of perceptual anomaly. He is ordered to cease independent monitoring activities and restrict his duties to assigned communication functions. Continued insistence on unsubstantiated claims regarding Astronomican degradation will result in removal from service and potential heresy investigation. I read the order 3 times, processing its implications. I was being silenced, not because my data was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. The system could not acknowledge the Astronomican's weakening without confronting implications it was not prepared to handle. Therefore, the system would deny the weakening existed and punish anyone who insisted otherwise. I had a choice to make. I could comply with the order, cease my monitoring, continue my assigned duties, and preserve my position and safety. Or I could continue monitoring, continue reporting, continue insisting on truth, regardless of consequences. Hadrian had warned me this moment would come, that I would need to decide whether maintaining truth mattered more than maintaining safety. I had 27 years of documented measurements. I had projections showing catastrophic failure within timescales the Imperium needed to acknowledge. I had observations that could save billions of lives if the Imperium began preparing for the Astronomican's eventual failure. But I also had direct orders to stop. Orders backed by threat of heresy investigation, which meant interrogation, torture, probable execution. The Imperium did not tolerate challenges to fundamental doctrines. The Emperor's power was eternal. The Astronomican would never fail. These were articles of faith, not subject to empirical questioning. I chose truth, not because I expected it to matter, but because stopping would not change what I was hearing. The Astronomican continued weakening whether I documented it or not. Remaining silent would simply mean the data was lost when the system finally acknowledged the problem decades or centuries later. I continued monitoring. I maintained my independent logs, hidden in encrypted files that official oversight would not detect without specific investigation. I performed my assigned duties without complaint or deviation, but privately, I tracked the beacon's decline with obsessive precision, accumulating data that contradicted the official narrative. For 3 years, this continued without incident. I monitored, I logged, I said nothing publicly. The Astronomican weakened by another point, 0.84%. The decay curve steepened slightly. My projections shortened, critical failure now estimated at 3,700 years instead of 4,000. In my 30th year of service, another astropath noticed my monitoring. Not deliberately, he was performing routine system maintenance and discovered my encrypted files while checking data storage allocation. His name was Matthias Seln, 62nd percentile sensitivity, 23 years service, absolutely conventional in his adherence to protocol and doctrine. He reported the discovery to Captain Vaughan immediately. Vaughan summoned me to his office. The meeting took place in his private quarters, away from official recording systems. He was trying to protect me, I realized, trying to give me opportunity to explain or recant before official channels became involved. "You were ordered to cease monitoring," he said without preamble. "You continued anyway. For 3 years, you have been violating direct orders, maintaining files that you were explicitly commanded to delete. Why? Because the data matters, Captain. Because someone needs to document what is happening. Because when the Imperium finally acknowledges the Astronomican's failure, they will need historical data to understand its progression. My logs may be the only comprehensive longitudinal study that exists." "Your logs are evidence of insubordination," Vaughan said. His voice carried exhaustion more than anger. "They are proof that you have continued activities you were ordered to cease. I cannot ignore this. If I fail to report it, I become complicit in your violation. You understand what happens next?" "Yes, Captain. You will be removed from service. You will be transported to Terra for investigation. If the investigation determines you are simply misguided, you will be executed quickly. If it determines you are spreading heresy deliberately, you will be interrogated until they are satisfied they have extracted every fragment of dangerous information from your mind. Then you will be executed slowly." He paused. "Is your data worth that?" I considered the question seriously. Was 30 years of measurements worth torture and execution? Would my death serve any purpose? Would anyone access my logs after I was gone, or would they be deleted along with me, erased from official records as if I had never existed? Probably the latter. Truth that contradicted official doctrine was dangerous. It would not be preserved. It would be destroyed along with everyone who insisted on maintaining it. But stopping would not change what I heard. The Astronomican was dying. Whether I documented it or not, whether anyone believed me or not, the beacon was failing, and perhaps someday, when the failure became too obvious to deny, someone would need the data I had accumulated, would need to understand how long the decline had been occurring, how consistent it had been, how predictable its progression was. "Yes, Captain," I said, "the data is worth that." Vaughan was silent for 43 seconds. Then he sighed, a sound that carried 3 decades of service and compromise and moral exhaustion. "I will file the report. You have approximately 6 hours before the Arbites arrive to take you into custody. Use that time however you wish." I returned to my quarters and finalized my logs. 30 years of measurements, compressed into data formats that would survive storage and transport. I created multiple copies, stored in different systems throughout the ship's networks, hidden in locations that would not be obvious to investigators, but might be discovered by someone looking carefully years or decades later. Then I sat on my bunk and listened to the Astronomican, really listened, with complete attention for the first time in months. I had been so focused on measuring and documenting that I had stopped simply experiencing what I was hearing. 15 billion voices, slightly quieter than they had been 3 decades ago. The harmony slightly degraded, individual singers occasionally falling out of sync before corrections brought them back into alignment. The fundamental structure remained intact, but stress was accumulating. Small cracks in a vast edifice, individually insignificant, but collectively indicating structural problems that would eventually cascade into catastrophic failure. I heard the Emperor's voice within the chorus. Not literally. The Emperor did not speak through the Astronomican. He simply powered it, his psychic presence converted into navigational beacon through mechanisms that few understood and none could replicate. But his presence was there, detectable as the fundamental tone beneath the choir's combined voices. And his presence was weaker than it had been, fading slowly and steadily, like a light source losing power as its fuel was consumed. The Golden Throne was failing. The Emperor was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but measurably. And because he powered the Astronomican, it was dying with him. This was the truth I had spent 30 years documenting. This was the reality the Imperium could not acknowledge. The Emperor was mortal after all. His power was not eternal. 10,000 years of sacrifice and psychic consumption was taking its toll, draining him slowly toward a final failure that would occur within timeframes that seemed vast to individuals, but were strategically immediate for a galactic civilization. The Arbites arrived 3 hours and 47 minutes later. They entered my quarters with weapons drawn, as if I might resist. I did not resist. I submitted to restraints without protest, allowed them to search my quarters and confiscate my personal effects. They found my data logs, the primary copies stored on personal devices. I did not mention the backup copies distributed throughout the ship's systems. They transported me to a detention cell in the ship's brig. Standard confinement, 3 meters by 2 meters, reinforced bulkheads, psychic dampening fields to prevent me from using my abilities to escape or communicate. A bunk, a waste reclamation unit, a light source that maintained constant illumination. No windows, no chronometer, no external stimuli. But they could not block the Astronomican. The dampening fields reduced my sensitivity, made it harder to perceive psychic phenomena clearly, but the beacon was too powerful to be completely blocked. I could still hear it, muffled and distant, like sound heard through thick walls. 15 billion voices, fading slowly, dying incrementally, continuing regardless of whether anyone acknowledged the decline. I remained in the brig for 6 weeks while the ship completed its current mission and began transit back to Segmentum Solar. During this time, I had no visitors, no communication, no stimuli except my own thoughts and the muffled presence of the Astronomican. I discovered something during these weeks. Without external distractions, without duties or routines, consciousness turns inward and begins processing itself. I reviewed memories with obsessive detail. My childhood on a hive world whose name I could barely remember. My testing and selection as Psyker. My soul binding. My 30 years of service. I examined my choices, my decisions, my path from young Astropath with unusual sensitivity to prisoner awaiting heresy investigation. I had done nothing wrong. I had observed accurately, measured precisely, reported honestly. I had served the Imperium faithfully for 30 years, and the Imperium was going to execute me for it. Because I had observed something inconvenient, because truth was less valuable than stability, because acknowledging the Astronomican's weakness would create problems that the system was not prepared to handle. This was not injustice. Injustice implies deviation from proper function. This was the system functioning exactly as designed. The Imperium was not built on truth. It was built on necessary fictions that allowed it to continue operating despite impossible realities. My observations threatened one of those necessary fictions. The consequences followed logically. I felt no anger about this. Anger requires believing the system should function differently. I understood the system too completely for such beliefs. I simply recognized what was happening and accepted it as inevitable outcome of my choices. During the 5th week, something changed in the Astronomican. A sudden fluctuation, larger than anything I had previously detected. The amplitude dropped by 0.013% over the course of 6 hours, a decline that normally would have taken months, compressed into a fraction of a day. The harmonic structure distorted noticeably, voices falling out of sync in numbers that exceeded normal replacement rates. Then it stabilized. The amplitude recovered slightly, the harmonics realigned. Whatever had caused the fluctuation resolved or was corrected, but the event was significant. It suggested the decay was not perfectly smooth, but included discrete failure events. Moments when some component of the system collapsed and had to be compensated for through emergency measures. I had no way to report this observation, no communication access, no official channels available. I simply noted it in memory, adding it to the comprehensive archive I maintained in my own neural structures. The undying fidelity reached terror after 6 weeks of transit. I was transferred from the ship's brig to administrative custody, transported through Terra's orbital facilities to the surface, delivered to interrogation chambers operated by the Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus. These were the specialists in identifying and purging heretical thought, in determining whether deviations from doctrine represented innocent error or willful corruption. The interrogation cell was larger than the ship's brig, but more oppressive. 7 meters by 5 meters, walls covered in inscriptions of imperial prayers and doctrinal passages. A single chair bolted to the floor with comprehensive restraint systems. The psychic dampening here was far more severe. Multi-layered fields that reduced my sensitivity to almost nothing. The Astronomican became barely perceptible whisper, distant and uncertain. My interrogator was an inquisitor named Severus Crail. He was 109 years old, had served the Ordo Hereticus for 74 years, had condemned approximately 6,000 individuals to execution after determining they represented threats to imperial doctrine. He entered the interrogation cell with the absolute certainty of someone who had never encountered ambiguity he could not resolve through violence. "You are Valen Corfus," he said. Not a question. Astropath, 30th year of service, charged with persistent dissemination of destabilizing information regarding the Astronomican's integrity. You have been warned repeatedly to cease these activities. You have violated direct orders. You have maintained forbidden records. You have insisted on interpretations of the Astronomican's function that contradict official doctrine and threaten the stability of the Imperium's navigational infrastructure. He paused. "What do you have to say in your defense?" "My observations are accurate," I said. "The Astronomican is weakening measurably. My data is comprehensive and precise. If the Imperium investigates objectively, it will confirm my findings." "The Imperium has investigated," Crail said. "The Departamento Astrographicus operates the most sophisticated monitoring equipment in human history. Their instruments detect no weakening. Therefore, your observations are either perceptual artifacts or deliberate fabrications designed to undermine faith in the Emperor's power." "I am not undermining faith. I am reporting measurements. Measurements that suggest the Emperor is failing, that his power is diminishing, that the Golden Throne is inadequate to sustain his existence. These are not neutral observations. They are theological claims with profound implications. If accepted, they would undermine the foundational doctrine that the Emperor protects humanity eternally. Citizens would lose faith. Stability would collapse. Systems would fragment. Your measurements, accurate or not, are weapons aimed at the Imperium's core." I understood what he was articulating. The truth value of my observations was irrelevant. What mattered was their effect on Imperial stability. True information that destabilized was more dangerous than false information that maintained cohesion. The Imperium required certain fictions to function. My data threatened those fictions. Therefore, my data had to be suppressed regardless of its accuracy. "The Imperium will face this reality eventually," I said. "The Astronomican will continue weakening whether I report it or not. Suppressing my data does not change what is happening. It simply delays acknowledging the problem." "And that delay is valuable," Crail replied. 4,000 years you estimated in your report. That is sufficient time for the Mechanicus to develop alternative navigational technologies, for the Imperium to reorganize its structure to accommodate beacon failure, for society to adapt to changed circumstances. But those 4,000 years of preparation time only exists if current stability is maintained. If your data becomes public now, panic will undermine the systems necessary to develop those solutions. You understand? Your silence is not suppression of truth. It is protection of the future capacity to address truth. This was sophisticated reasoning, more sophisticated than I had expected from an Inquisitor. Crail was not simply enforcing blind doctrine. He was making calculated decisions about information management across strategic timeframes. "I understand the logic," I said, "but my silence does not guarantee future preparation. The Imperium has suppressed my data for 30 years already. In that time, has the Mechanicus developed alternative navigational technologies? Has imperial structure been reorganized? Have preparations been made? Or has my silence simply enabled continued denial? Krail was quiet for 11 seconds. That is not your concern. Your concern is whether you serve the Emperor through continued existence or through termination. I am offering you a choice. Recant your observations. Acknowledge them as perceptual errors. Submit to minor corrective punishment and return to service with reduced sensitivity through controlled psychic damage. Or maintain your position and be executed as heretic who spread lies about the Emperor's weakening. They are not lies. Then you choose execution. I considered the choice he was offering. Live by denying what I knew, or die maintaining truth that would be suppressed regardless. Neither option accomplished anything useful. My data would not be preserved, my warnings would not be heeded. My 30 years of observation would be erased as if they had never existed. But I could not recant, not because of pride or principle, but because doing so would require lying about what I heard every moment of my existence. The Astronomican was weakening. I heard it continuously. Denying that reality would mean denying my own perceptions, fragmenting my consciousness around contradictions I could not sustain. I cannot recant what I observed directly, I said. The Astronomican is weakening. This is not interpretation or theory. It is direct sensory experience, as immediate as sight or sound for baseline humans. Asking me to deny it is asking me to deny my own consciousness. Then you are a heretic, Krail said, and you will be processed accordingly. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted 6 hours. Formal presentation of charges, review of evidence, theological analysis of my claims and their implications. The verdict was predetermined. I was declared a heretic who had deliberately spread lies designed to undermine faith in the Emperor's eternal power. The sentence was death by execution, to be carried out within standard processing timeframes. But something unusual happened during the sentencing phase. One of the attending inquisitors, a younger man named Porus Valence, who had remained silent throughout the trial, raised an objection. The subject claimed direct sensory perception of the Astronomican's degradation, Valence said. His sensitivity is documented as 99th percentile. Before we execute him for heretical observations, should we not verify whether his perceptions are accurate? If he is correct, and the Astronomican is weakening, executing him serves no purpose except destroying evidence of systemic failure. Krail regarded Valence with expression that combined annoyance and professional respect. You are suggesting we investigate his claims seriously? Despite 30 years of official denial, I am suggesting we verify empirical claims before declaring them heretical. If he is wrong, we execute a madman. If he is right, we execute someone trying to warn us about catastrophic system failure. The distinction matters. There was silence in the chamber for 23 seconds. Then Krail spoke carefully. Such investigation would require access to the Astronomican facility's classified monitoring data. It would require acknowledging officially that concerns exist about the beacon's integrity. It would create documentation that could not be easily suppressed if the investigation confirms degradation. The political consequences would be significant. Less significant than discovering the Astronomican has been failing for decades while we executed everyone who tried to warn us, Valence replied. Another silence, longer this time. I could feel the tension between pragmatic information management and institutional self-preservation. Krail was being asked to potentially validate observations that would undermine the narrative he had spent 74 years enforcing. Valence was risking his own career by suggesting the Inquisition might have been wrong for 3 decades. Finally, Krail spoke. Very well. The execution is postponed pending verification investigation. Astropath Corpus will be held in custody while inquiry is conducted into Astronomican integrity measurements. If the investigation confirms degradation, his observations will be reclassified as accurate reporting and his sentence commuted. If the investigation finds no evidence of degradation, his execution will proceed as scheduled. I was returned to my cell. The investigation, I was informed, would take approximately 18 months to complete, time required to access classified systems, review historical data, conduct independent measurements, and produce comprehensive report. 18 months in isolation. 18 months of psychic dampening, sensory deprivation, consciousness confined to a cell without stimuli. 18 months to discover whether I would die for observing accurately or live for observing what the Imperium preferred not to acknowledge. I spent those months in a state that resembled sleep, but was not sleep. Without external stimuli, without duties or routines, consciousness becomes strange. Time loses coherence. Minutes and hours and days blur into continuous present without distinction. Memory becomes more real than current experience. I existed in recursive loops of recollection, reviewing my life over and over, processing it obsessively because there was nothing else to process. I thought about my soul binding, the 11 minutes and 47 seconds when my consciousness touched something vast enough to burn away my eyes. I had believed then that I was serving the Emperor, dedicating my abilities to his eternal purpose. Now I understood that I had simply been converted into component, biological sensor, integrated into the Imperium's information systems. My service had never been voluntary. It had been extraction of utility from resources that would otherwise be wasted or destroyed. I thought about Hadrian, his warning that truth would not protect me, that insisting on accurate observations would place me in conflict with systems that required denial. He had known this would happen, had prepared me for it as much as preparation was possible. I wondered if he had ever faced similar conflicts during his 3 centuries of service, whether he had ever possessed information that contradicted imperial doctrine and had to choose between speaking and surviving. He had chosen speaking in his way, had told me to maintain independent archives, to document truth even when official systems refused to acknowledge it, had validated my observations when everyone else dismissed them. And he had died on Cadia, defending evacuation ships, serving the Imperium faithfully until the end, despite knowing its foundational doctrines were compromised by necessary fictions. I thought about the Astronomican. Even muffled by the dampening fields, I could still hear it. The voices had changed during my imprisonment. Subtle shifts in harmonic structure, slight amplitude variations, the ongoing decay that continued regardless of whether anyone monitored it. The beacon was dying. Slowly, predictably, measurably dying. And I was being imprisoned for observing this, while the system that could potentially address the problem continued denying it existed. This was the Imperium in microcosm. A vast structure built on fictions that could not be questioned without threatening collapse. Truth was dangerous. Observation was heretical. Accuracy was treason. The system sustained itself through denial, through suppressing information that might require adaptation or change, through destroying anyone who insisted on acknowledging inconvenient realities. 18 months passed, or I believed 18 months passed. Time was difficult to track in isolation. Eventually, the cell door opened. Inquisitor Valence entered, alone, carrying a data slate. "The investigation is complete," he said without preamble. "I wanted to inform you personally before the official verdict is announced." I waited. His expression was carefully neutral, but I detected stress in his psychic presence even through the dampening fields. "We conducted comprehensive analysis," he continued. "Reviewed 30 years of classified monitoring data from the Astronomican facility. Performed independent measurements using the most sensitive equipment available. Consulted with senior tech priests who maintain the Golden Throne systems. The conclusion is definitive." He paused. "You are correct. The Astronomican is weakening, measurably, consistently, progressively. The amplitude has decreased by 0.29% over the past 3 decades. The harmonic drift matches your documented observations. The voice replacement rate has accelerated exactly as you calculated. Every parameter you tracked shows degradation consistent with systemic failure occurring over multi-millennial timeframes." I felt nothing at this confirmation. No vindication, no satisfaction, just recognition that reality had been verified. Your observations were accurate, Valence continued. Your reporting was appropriate. Your warnings were ignored due to institutional denial that prioritized stability over truth. You should never have been charged with heresy. Your sentence should be overturned, your service record cleared, your data integrated into official monitoring systems. He stopped. The silence stretched. Should be, I said, but will not be. Valence's expression confirmed this. The investigation's findings are being classified at the highest levels. Access is restricted to Inquisition leadership and senior administrative officials. The data will not be made public. Your observations will not be officially acknowledged. The Imperium is not prepared to confront the implications of Astronomican failure. Accepting your data would require a fundamental reorganization of Imperial doctrine, infrastructure, and long-term planning. The leadership has determined this reorganization cannot occur at present without catastrophic stability consequences. So I was right, and I will be executed anyway. Your sentence is being modified, Valence said carefully, not execution. Permanent imprisonment. You will be held in isolation indefinitely, in facilities specifically designed for psychers, whose observations or abilities are deemed too dangerous for release, but too valuable for termination. You will be maintained alive, in case your sensitivity proves useful in future crisis. But you will never be released. You will never communicate your findings. You will exist in isolation until natural death or system failure terminates your consciousness. He paused. I argued against this. I insisted that your warning should be heeded. Your data preserved officially. Preparations begun immediately. I was overruled. The decision is final. Why inform me personally? Because you deserve to know that you were correct, that your 30 years of observation served truth, even if they did not serve the Imperium's preferred narratives. And because, he stopped, choosing words carefully, because I am maintaining copies of your data independently. If the Imperium ever reaches point where it can acknowledge the Astronomican's failure, your observations will be available. Your service will be recognized, eventually, after you are dead. He departed without further comment. The cell door sealed. I was transferred the next day to the facility he had described, a specialized prison for dangerous psychers, located in Terra's deep sublevels, isolated behind psychic dampening so severe that the Astronomican became completely inaudible. For the first time in 31 years, I could not hear the beacon. The silence was absolute. Not peaceful, wrong like losing a fundamental sense. I had been listening to the Astronomican for my entire adult life. Its absence created a void in my consciousness that nothing could fill. I existed in that void for years. Decades, perhaps. I lost count without the beacon to mark time's passage. The facility was designed to minimize stimuli and prevent meaningful interaction with other prisoners. My cell was larger than previous confinement, 4 meters by 6 meters, containing a bunk, a small table, a waste reclamation unit, and a single light source. Food arrived through automated delivery systems. No guards entered, no communication was permitted. I was isolated completely, consciousness confined to itself without external input. This was the isolation sequence that would define my existence. Not temporary imprisonment awaiting resolution, but permanent containment without prospect of change. I was being stored, warehoused, like any other dangerous material that could not be destroyed but must not be released. I developed routines to maintain sanity. I counted heartbeats, breaths, the passage of seconds and minutes and hours reconstructed from physiological rhythms. I exercised within the cell's limited space, maintaining physical function because allowing the body to degrade would accelerate mental collapse. I recited prayers from memory, not because I believed them, but because the familiar words provided structure. And I remembered, reviewed my life in obsessive detail, processing it from multiple angles, extracting every fragment of meaning that might justify the decades of confinement. I had observed the Astronomican's decline, I had documented it precisely. I had reported it honestly. I had been correct. And I was being permanently imprisoned for it. This was the cost of truth in a system built on necessary fictions. Not execution, which would be mercy. Not vindication, which would require acknowledging uncomfortable realities. Simply removal. Extracting me from the system and containing me where my observations could not spread, where my data could not destabilize, where my presence could not remind anyone that the Imperium's foundational beacon was slowly failing. I thought about the Astropaths who had served with me over 31 years, Tybalt, who had died after 49 years of service without recognition, Cormac, who had corroborated my observations before psychic degradation claimed him. The dozens of others who cycled through assignments, performed their functions, died or were executed, or simply disappeared into the vast machinery of imperial bureaucracy. None of them had heard what I heard. None of them had perceived the decline. They had served faithfully within normal parameters and been consumed by the system without ever knowing they were components rather than individuals. I thought about the pilots and navigators who depended on the Astronomican to guide them through the warp. Thousands of ships at any given moment scattered across the galaxy, using the beacon as reference point for faster-than-light travel. They trusted that the light would continue, that the Emperor's power was eternal, that the system would sustain them. They did not know the beacon was failing, did not know that within millennia the light would fade and leave them stranded in darkness between stars. I thought about future generations, the humans who would be born in 2,000 years, 4,000 years, 8,000 years. They would inherit an Imperium approaching collapse as the Astronomican weakened beyond sustainability. If preparations were made now, they might survive. If alternative navigational technologies were developed, regional beacon systems established, civilization restructured to function without galaxy-spanning coordination, humanity might adapt to the coming darkness. But those preparations were not being made. The problem was being denied, and by the time denial became impossible, it would be too late for effective adaptation. My observations could have provided the data needed to begin that preparation, could have given the Imperium centuries or millennia of warning time. But the data had been suppressed. I had been imprisoned, and the decline continued unacknowledged while precious time was wasted maintaining fictions. Years passed in isolation. My body aged, deteriorated despite my attempts at maintenance. My consciousness became strange. Extended sensory deprivation produces psychological effects that accumulate irreversibly. I began experiencing hallucinations, phantom sensations, memory loops where I could not distinguish between recollection and present experience. The boundaries of self became uncertain. But one perception remained constant. Even through the facility's dampening fields, even reduced to barely perceptible whisper, I could still hear the Astronomican. It was always there, background presence at the edge of awareness, and it continued weakening. I tracked the decline through the years, marking its progression by subtle shifts in what little I could perceive. The amplitude decreased further. The harmony degraded. The number of voices seemed smaller, though I could not count them precisely through the interference. The beacon was dying, slowly, inexorably, predictably dying. And I was the only person who knew, the only consciousness monitoring the decline, while imprisoned for acknowledging it. The only witness to a catastrophe that would unfold across millennia, trapped in isolation where my testimony could not matter. This was the final truth I carried. Not simply that the Astronomican was failing, but that the system designed to prevent such failures had instead prevented acknowledgement of the failure. The Imperium's protection mechanisms had become suppression mechanisms. Safety protocols had become denial protocols. The very systems meant to preserve humanity were ensuring it could not prepare for existential threats. I was evidence of this dysfunction. I represented the fate of anyone who observed accurately, who reported honestly, who insisted on truth when truth contradicted doctrine. The Imperium did not kill such people. Killing created martyrs. It simply removed them, imprisoned them. made them disappear into facilities where their observations could not spread and their data could not challenge the necessary fictions. Somewhere above me, on Terra's surface and across the galaxy, the Imperium continued functioning. Ships navigated by the Astronomican's light. Astropaths transmitted messages across the void. The vast machinery of human civilization operated according to patterns established over 10 millennia. And a beacon that made it all possible continued dying, unacknowledged, unaddressed, approaching inevitable failure, while the system denied any problem existed. I would not live to see that failure. My life was measured in decades. The beacon's decline was measured in millennia. I would die in this cell, forgotten, my observations lost, except for whatever copies Inquisitor Valence had maintained independently. Perhaps those copies would surface eventually. Perhaps someone would review my data after I was dead and recognize its value. Perhaps my warnings would finally be heeded when the decline became too obvious to deny. Or perhaps not. Perhaps my data would be destroyed along with me, erased as if it had never existed. Perhaps the Imperium would continue denying the Astronomican's weakness until the beacon failed completely and left humanity stranded in darkness without preparation or hope. I could not control that outcome. I could only bear witness. Record what I observed, preserve it in consciousness even if no external archive survived, maintain testimony against the silence that sought to erase it. This is what I am documenting now. My final testament, composed in isolation, recorded through whatever means might preserve it. I am Valen Corfus. I served as Astropath for 31 years. I observed the Astronomican's systematic weakening over that period. I reported my observations through appropriate channels. I was dismissed, silenced, and imprisoned for insisting on truth that contradicted imperial doctrine. I was correct. The Astronomican is failing. The Emperor's power is not eternal. The Golden Throne cannot sustain him indefinitely. Within 4,000 years, the beacon will weaken to critical levels. Within 8,000 years, it will fail completely. The Imperium as it currently exists will end. These are facts, not theories. Measurements, not speculation. 31 years of continuous observation compressed into projections that anyone with sufficient sensitivity could verify. The data exists. The decline is real. The catastrophe is approaching. But the Imperium cannot acknowledge this, cannot confront the implications, cannot begin preparing for a future without the beacon because preparing would require admitting the problem exists. So it denies, suppresses, imprisons anyone who insists otherwise. I am one such person. There have been others before me. I discovered references to them during my research, brief mentions of astropaths who reported anomalies and were silenced. There will be others after me as the decline continues and more sensitive psychers detect what I detected. They will be silenced too, removed, imprisoned, or executed. The pattern will continue until denial becomes impossible. By then, it will be too late for effective preparation. The Imperium will face the Astronomican's failure without warning, without plans, without alternatives. Billions will die in the chaos that follows. Human civilization will fragment into isolated pockets, separated by warp spaces that can no longer be navigated safely. The unity that the Emperor purchased with 10,000 years of sacrifice will dissolve because the system could not acknowledge that sacrifice had duration and limits. This is the cost of necessary fictions. Not simply individual suffering, my imprisonment, others' executions, the silencing of accurate observations, but systemic inability to confront existential threats. The Imperium has become so invested in certain narratives that it cannot adapt to realities that contradict those narratives. It would rather face catastrophe unprepared than admit its fundamental doctrines are wrong. I understand why. The psychological and political costs of admitting the Emperor is dying. The Astronomican is failing. The entire imperial structure is built on foundations that are crumbling. Those costs are immense. Accepting my data would require questioning everything, would create panic, instability, potential collapse before alternative systems could be established. But denying the data does not change the reality. It simply ensures the Imperium will face that reality without preparation. My silence, bought through imprisonment, does not make the Astronomican stronger. It makes humanity weaker by preventing adaptation. This is what I want preserved, not as accusation or condemnation, but as testimony, as record of what I observed, what I reported, what happened when I insisted on truth. As evidence that the warnings came early enough to matter, that time existed for preparation, that the catastrophe could have been mitigated if the system had been capable of acknowledging it. Perhaps this testimony will survive. Perhaps someone will find it after I am dead, review my data, recognize its value. Perhaps my observations will contribute to eventual preparation, even if that preparation comes too late for me to witness. Or perhaps not. Perhaps I will die in isolation, forgotten, my data lost. Perhaps the Imperium will stumble into the darkness blind, unprepared, unable to understand how it failed to see catastrophe approaching for millennia. I cannot control which outcome occurs. I can only maintain the record, bear witness to what I observed, preserve truth even when truth is dangerous, even when acknowledging reality leads to imprisonment, even when the system insists that denial is safer than adaptation. The Astronomican is dying. I have heard it dying for 31 years. I will hear it dying until I die myself, alone in this cell, maintaining testimony that may never matter, but cannot be abandoned because abandoning it would mean accepting that observation has no value, that truth has no meaning, that the system's denial is more real than objective reality. I am still counting, still listening, still bearing witness. The beacon weakens, the voices fade, the light dims. And I remain here, imprisoned for acknowledging what anyone with sufficient sensitivity could verify if the system permitted verification. This is my testimony. This is what I have witnessed. This is what cost me everything and accomplished nothing except maintaining a record that probably no one will ever access. The Astronomican is dying. I heard it dying. I reported it dying. I was imprisoned for reporting it. Decades from now, centuries from now, when the decline becomes too obvious to deny, perhaps someone will remember that warnings came, that observation was possible, that the catastrophe could have been prepared for if truth had been valued over stability. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the Imperium will face the darkness believing it came without warning, never knowing that warnings were suppressed, that accurate observations were punished, that the system destroyed everyone who tried to help it adapt. I will not live to know which outcome occurs. I will die here in isolation, listening to the beacon fade. This is the cursed life of an astropath who could hear the Astronomican dying. Not cursed by the ability itself, but cursed by serving a system that valued denial over truth, stability over adaptation, necessary fictions over accurate observations. I heard the Emperor's beacon failing. I documented it precisely. I reported it honestly. And I was imprisoned for it. This is what remains. Consciousness in a cell, bearing witness to catastrophe the system refuses to acknowledge, maintaining testimony against silence. The beacon fades. I listen, I count, I remember. This is all I can do. This is all that remains.